The morning the horses came was a Tuesday in early April of 1998. I remember the air had that particular damp chill to it, the kind that promises a warm afternoon but isn't in any hurry to deliver it. The sky was the color of old tin, flat and gray, and the fog was settled so thick in the low spots it looked like you could walk out on it. I'd been up since 4, not out of necessity, but because I knew the truck was due around 6 and I couldn't settle. I'd made the call 3 weeks prior, and for 21 straight nights, I'd laid awake and questioned the decision. You can spend a lifetime on a piece of ground and still find new ways to doubt yourself. My wife, Martha, she'd listened to the whole plan, her face giving away nothing. When I was done, she took a slow sip of her coffee and asked the one question that mattered. How much was the skid steer? I told her the dealer had quoted me $42,500 for the new model, the one with the enclosed cab and the joystick controls. He'd even offered to bring it out for a demonstration. She just nodded. And the horses? I told her the price. It was less, but not by enough to make it seem like a sensible bargain. It was enough to be a choice. A statement, I suppose, though I didn't know what I was trying to state just yet. She didn't say another word about it, which in its own way is a kind of trust. Or maybe it's just the patience of a woman who has seen a man follow a strange notion before and knows you just have to let it run its course. The truck came over the rise just as the sun was starting to burn the gray out of the eastern sky. It was a long silver pot, a livestock hauler out of southern Ohio, and the sound of it gearing down on the county road was a heavy, serious thing. I had the gate to the east pasture open. 25 of them, Belgian drafts, geldings and mares, none younger than 5, none older than 12. Big, quiet animals, their coats the color of straw and their manes and tails almost white. They came down the ramp one by one, their heads up, taking in the new place. Their hooves made a soft, thudding sound on the packed earth of the lane. They weren't nervous. They were just paying attention. My grandfather always said that about a good draft horse. He said, they pay attention to the world in a way a machine can't. A machine only knows what you tell it. A horse knows the ground. I hadn't thought about that saying in 30 years. As I stood there, watching them fan out into the wet grass, the sheer mass of them was humbling. They were mountains of muscle, each one weighing close to a ton, and yet they moved with a quiet grace. By 10 that morning, my neighbor Dave had made his way over. He didn't come to the house, just idled his new Ford F-350 at the fence line, the diesel engine making a low rumble. The truck was barely a year old, and I don't think it had ever seen a muddy field. He rolled down the passenger window, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. "Heard you were starting a circus," he said. It wasn't mean-spirited. That wasn't Dave's way. It was just his kind of joke, the kind that lets you know he thinks you've made a terrible mistake but is polite enough not to say it outright. "Something like that," I said, leaning against a fence post. The horses were already grazing, their heads down, their breath making little clouds in the cool air. "That's a lot of mouths to feed," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "What are you planning on doing with 25 draft horses on 160 acres? I told him I was going to clear the back 40. The back 40 was a problem we'd all had. My father, my grandfather, and me. It was good soil, a deep black loam, but it was littered with fieldstone, some of them the size of a bushel basket. For generations, we just plowed around it, leaving it to grow up in thistle and burdock. Every spring, the frost would heave up a new crop of rocks. A skid steer with a rock bucket, that was the modern answer. Fast, effizient. You could have it cleared in a week, maybe 2. Dave had done his own north pasture that way 2 years before. He looked from the horses back to me, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was a good man, a good farmer, but he believed in data and horsepower ratings. "You know," he said, trying to be helpful, "you can rent a skid steer for about $600 a day, with a grapple bucket. You'd be done by Memorial Day." I just nodded. "I know. I thought about it." He gave a little sigh, the kind of sound a man makes when he sees his neighbor about to learn a hard lesson and there's nothing he can do to stop it. "All right then," he said, putting the truck in drive. "Just remember, hay isn't getting any cheaper." He gave a little wave and pulled away, leaving me there with the quiet chewing of the horses and the weight of his certainty. By noon, the co-op had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I wasn't just clearing rocks. I was starting a horse-powered commune. I was plowing all my fields with them. I was rejecting the internal combustion engine entirely. Small towns have a way of taking a strange seed of a thing and growing it into a full-blown spectacle overnight. The phone rang a little after 1. It was the equipment dealer from town. "Just wanted to follow up," he said, his voice friendly, professional. "Wanted to see if you'd made a decision on that 773G. Got another fellow interested, but I told him I'd check with you first. I told him I'd gone a different direction." There was a pause. "Oh," he said. "You mind my asking what you went with?" "Another brand." I took a breath. "Horses," I said. The silence on the other end of the line was longer this time. It was a heavy, information-filled silence. "Horses," he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement of fact that he was trying to process. "Well, okay. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the Belgians. They were standing quiet in the pasture, their big bodies still patient. I didn't know yet what they knew. I only knew that I was betting on a memory, a feeling, and a cryptic note in a dead man's handwriting. I was betting on the idea that the ground remembers more than the machine does, and I was about to find out if I was right. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just sentiment. I'm not a man who can afford to farm on nostalgia. Every decision has to pay for itself sooner or later. The truth is, the idea didn't start with the horses. It started with my grandfather years ago. He passed when I was 19, but some of the things he said and did have stuck with me more than any lesson I ever learned in a classroom. He was a quiet man. He didn't speak unless he had something to say, and he had a way of looking at the land like he was reading a book that only he had the key to. He'd farmed the same ground, all of it, with horses. For big percherons, I remember them. He called them his boys. He knew every swell and dip in every field, not by looking at a topographical map, but by the feel of it through the soles of his boots and the strain on the harness lines in his hands. The summer I was 14, we had a dry spell. The creek was low, and the well at the house was starting to pump air. My grandfather spent a lot of time walking the back 40, that same rocky piece of ground I was now staring at. I'd tag along, not understanding what he was looking for. I just thought we were walking. One afternoon, he stopped near a slight depression, a place where the grass was a little greener than everywhere else, even in the dry heat. He pointed with his chin. "See how they walk around that spot?" he said. His 4 horses were in the adjacent pasture, and sure enough, they'd grazed a wide circle around that one area, leaving the grass in the middle untouched. "They know," he said. "They can feel it." I asked him what they could feel. "Hollow," he said. Just that one word. Heavy animal learns to trust its feet. It knows the difference between solid ground and a crust over nothing. Before men were here, the big animals knew. The buffalo, the elk. They knew where the springs were, where the sinkholes were, where the water ran underground. They taught us, if we were smart enough to pay attention, he never did anything about that spot. The rains came back a week later, the well recovered, and the memory of that dry spell faded. But the image of those horses avoiding that one patch of ground, that stayed with me. He was trying to tell me something, not just about finding water, but about a different way of knowing things. A way that didn't involve a soil sample sent to a lab or a geological survey map. It was a knowledge that came from patience, observation, and a trust in the instincts of the animals that walked the land alongside you. That was the real reason I bought the horses. The 42,000 for the skid steer felt like an ending. It was a single, loud, efficient answer to a simple problem, rocks. But the horses, they felt like a question. They were a slower, quieter, more complicated way of doing things, and I had a feeling the problem of the back 40 was more complicated than just rocks. After my grandfather passed, my father and I were cleaning out the old milk house. Tucked away in a wooden crate beneath a pile of old harnesses and rusted tools was a small stack of my grandfather's notebooks. They were simple composition books, the kind with the marbled black and white covers. His name was written on the front of each one in careful, steady cursive, along with the years the book covered. My father, he glanced at them and set them aside. He was a practical man, a man of his time. He'd been one of the first in the county to buy a diesel tractor, to embrace herbicides, to see the future in terms of efficiency and yield per acre. To him, the notebooks were relics of a bygone era, interesting perhaps, but not useful. I, on the other hand, felt a pull toward them. I took them. I told myself I'd read them someday. I put the box in the attic of our house, and for almost 30 years that's where they stayed. I'll own that. I got busy. I had a family, a farm to run, bills to pay. The modern world has a way of filling up all the quiet spaces where you might sit down with a box of old notebooks. I got caught up in the same cycle of efficiency and production as everyone else. I thought about the notebooks from time to time, usually on a cold winter night when the wind was howling outside, but I always found a reason not to get them down. I think, if I'm honest, I was a little afraid of what I might find, or what I wouldn't find. I was afraid they'd be nothing more than old weather records and calving dates, and that the quiet wisdom I'd built up in my memory of my grandfather was just a story I'd told myself. It's easier to live with a comforting myth than a disappointing reality. But after I made the call about the horses, after I'd committed myself to this path that everyone else saw as foolish, I knew it was time. The night before the horses were due to arrive, I went up to the attic. The air was cold and still, smelling of old wood and dust. I found the crate right where I'd left it. I pried open the lid, and there they were. 7 notebooks in all, covering the years from 1935 to 1962. I took the whole box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. Martha was already in bed. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I just sat there for a long time, looking at the box, at the faded covers of the books. I was choosing to trust a dead man's way of thinking over a living salesman's proven machine. I was betting on a story from my boyhood, and now I was finally ready to see if my grandfather had left me a map. I started with the last notebook, the one marked 1958 to 1962. The paper was soft and yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still a dark, crisp blue. His handwriting was small and precise, the letters leaning slightly to the right. It was the hand of a man who didn't waste motion or space. The first few pages were just what I'd expected. Daily weather observations, planting dates, notes on livestock. April 12, 1958. Rain overnight, 7 inches. Soil temp 48 degrees. Planted corn in the south field.
Bessie calved, a healthy bull.
Looks strong. It was the simple, rhythmic language of a farmer's life. It was grounding to read it. I could almost hear his voice, feel the quiet cadence of his days. I paged through, looking for any mention of the back 40. He called it the North Pasture then. There were notes about mending the fence line, about the stubbornness of the burdock that grew there, about the number of rocks he'd hauled off it with a stone boat and his team. But there was nothing about a hollow spot, nothing about water. I worked my way backwards through the notebooks, through the 1950s and into the late 40s. The story was much the same. A life lived in close observation of the seasons, the animals, and the land. He noted the first frost, the day the swallows returned, the price he got for his milk at the creamery. It was a world of detail, a world of paying attention. I felt a pang of something like regret. We don't keep records like this anymore. We have spreadsheets and apps, columns of data, but this felt different. This was a conversation. A 30-year conversation between a man and his piece of the earth. I was almost to the bottom of the box on the second-to-last notebook, the one for 1941 to 1945. The war years. The entries were sparser here. Notes about rationing, about the price of steel, about neighbors' sons who had gone overseas. And then I found it. It wasn't a long entry. It was on a page in the back of the book, a page he'd reserved for sketches and calculations. He'd drawn a rough map of the farm, the fields laid out in hand-drawn squares and rectangles. He'd labeled each one in his neat script. And there, on the section marked North Pasture, he'd drawn a small X in pencil. It was in the approximate location of that slight depression I remembered from my boyhood. Next to the X, he had written 2 words and a question mark, Cistern. Below that, Another short phrase, check spring line, and then, underlined twice, were two more words. Never dug. My heart started beating a little faster. A cistern. Not a well, not a sinkhole. A cistern. That implied it was man-made. Lined. Contained. A reservoir. Why would there be a cistern out in the middle of a rocky pasture, far from any barn or house? It didn't make sense. But the words check spring line offered a clue. A spring-fed cistern. That would be a different thing altogether. A self-replenishing source of water. A treasure. The words never dug were the key. It was a question he had never answered. A piece of unfinished business. He had suspected something was there, deep in the ground, but for whatever reason, the war, the work, the lack of a pressing need, he had never taken a shovel to it. He had observed, he had noted, and he had left the question for someone else to answer. For me, I sat back in my chair, the notebook open on the table in front of me. The single bare bulb overhead cast a pool of light on the page. The rest of the kitchen was in shadow. The house was still. I felt a sudden, powerful connection to him, to this man I had only known as a boy. This wasn't just a cryptic note. It was a gift, a piece of inherited knowledge, passed down not in a will or a deed, but in pencil on the back page of a cheap notebook. He was telling me where to look. He was confirming the story he'd told me with his horses all those years ago. The doubt I'd been wrestling with for weeks, the chorus of skeptical voices from my neighbors and the equipment dealer, it all began to fade. It wasn't that I was suddenly certain I was right. Certainty is a fool's game. But I was no longer acting on a whim or a fuzzy memory. I was following a map. I had a reason, a solid one, rooted in the careful observations of a man who knew this land better than anyone. I closed the notebook and placed it carefully back in the box. I knew what I had to do. The plan was no longer just about clearing rocks. That was the cover story, the simple explanation for a complicated hunch. The real work was to let the horses show me the way. To see if their ancient instinct, the one my grandfather had trusted, would lead me to the same spot he had marked with a pencil 60 years before. I was going to use the oldest method to investigate one of the farm's oldest secrets. The next morning, when the livestock hauler rumbled down the lane, I wasn't just buying 25 head of livestock. I was hiring 25 very large, very heavy surveyors. And their only tool was the wisdom in their feet. I didn't tell Martha about the notebook, not right away. I wanted to see what the ground would tell me first. Some things you have to carry by yourself for a while until you know what they weigh. The first week with the horses was a lesson in humility. I hadn't thrown a harness on a draft animal in 30 years, and my body reminded me of that fact in no uncertain terms. My hands were soft from the cushioned steering wheels of modern tractors. My back wasn't used to the solid, unyielding weight of leather and steel. But the knowledge was still there, buried under layers of time. It came back in the feel of the buckles, the smell of the harness oil, the quiet patience of the animals as I fumbled with the straps. I started with just one team, two big geldings named Ben and Jerry. They were older, seasoned, and had a calm, been-there-done-that demeanor that was exactly what I needed. I hitched them to a simple stone boat, a heavy wooden sled my grandfather had built decades ago. The goal for now wasn't efficiency. It was observation. The back 40 was just as I remembered it. A rolling expanse of good grass interspersed with the gray, rounded shoulders of buried rocks. The first few days I just worked them back and forth across the western edge of the field, the farthest point from the spot my grandfather had marked. I wanted to get a feel for them, for the rhythm of their work, and I wanted them to get a feel for the ground under their feet. The work was slow, methodical. The only sounds were the creak of the harness leather, the jingle of the chains, the soft huff of the horse's breath, and the grating scrape of the stone boat over the earth. When we'd load a rock onto it, the sound of it landing on the thick oak planks was a satisfying thud. We'd haul it to the fence line and add it to the stone wall that my family had been building for 100 years. It was a slow way to make progress. By the end of the first week, I'd cleared a patch of ground maybe 50 feet square. A skid steer would have done it in an hour. Dave drove by a couple of times, slowing his truck but not stopping. I could feel his gaze on my back. I knew what he was thinking. I looked like a man playing at farming, a historical reenactor lost in a sentimental dream. I didn't care. I was learning to see the field not as a grid to be conquered, but as a living thing with its own history and secrets. I was learning to read the language of the horses. They spoke in the flick of an ear, the tensing of a shoulder, a slight hesitation in their stride. By the second week, I felt we were ready. I started working them in a new pattern, a long grid that would take us over the area where I remembered the depression being, the place my grandfather had marked on his map. The sun was warmer now, the ground was drying out. The work fell into a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Walk, stop, pry a rock loose with the big iron bar, roll it onto the sled, walk again. The horses were magnificent. They knew the work. A slight pressure on the lines, a quiet word, and they would lean into the harness, their massive shoulders bunching with muscle, and the sled would move, no matter how heavy the load. They never rushed. They just applied a steady, relentless pressure. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, late in the second week, that I saw it for the first time. We were making a pass across the center of the field. The ground looked flat, uniform. But as we approached a certain spot, Ben, the horse on the left, hesitated. It was almost imperceptible. His gait didn't change, but there was a tension in the lines that wasn't there a moment before. He shifted his weight slightly to the right, his ears swiveling. Jerry, on the other side, felt the shift and compensated, but he too seemed to be walking more carefully. They pulled the sled right over the spot without stopping, but I had felt it. A flicker of uncertainty, an animal's question mark. I stopped them at the end of the row and let them rest. I walked back to the spot. To my eye, it was no different from any other piece of ground in that field. The grass was the same height, the soil looked the same. I stomped on it with my boot. Felt solid. I told myself I was imagining it, projecting what I wanted to see onto the behavior of the animals. The next day, I made sure to come at it from a different angle. I worked a perpendicular line so we would cross the same spot. Again, as we got within 10 or 15 feet of it, the same thing happened. A subtle change in the horse's demeanor, a tightening of the lines, a shared moment of caution between two one-ton animals. This time, Ben actually shied, taking a quick step to the side, forcing Jerry to halt. They stood there, ears forward, looking at the ground as if it held a snake. They did not want to walk on that spot. I didn't force them. I guided them around it and continued on. My grandfather's words came back to me, clear as if he were standing beside me. They can feel it. Hollow, I spent the rest of the week testing the theory. I brought out different teams. I worked them in circles, in diagonals. And every single time, the result was the same. The horses, all of them, would avoid an area roughly 20 feet in diameter. They would walk up to its edge and then, with an unshakable, quiet insistence, they would go around. They weren't spooked or frightened. They were just definite. They were stating a fact. This ground is different. This ground is not to be trusted. On Saturday morning, I didn't even bother with the harness. I walked out to the field with a roll of orange flagging tape and a dozen thin wooden stakes. I let the horses into the back 40 to graze. And I watched. They fanned out, their heads down, but not a single one of them would step inside that invisible circle. They grazed right up to the edge of it, creating a perfect, living boundary. I walked the perimeter they had created, pushing the wooden stakes into the ground every few feet. When I was done, I had a rough circle marked out in the middle of the field. A circle defined not by a surveyor's transit, but by the collective, instinctual wisdom of 25 Belgian draft horses. I stood in the center of that circle. The sun was on my face. A breeze moved through the grass. The ground felt firm beneath my feet. But I was standing in a place that every heavy animal on my farm had unanimously declared unsafe. I went back to the barn and got the soil probe. The soil probe is a simple tool. It's a 3-foot length of solid steel, about half an inch in diameter, with a T-handle welded to the top and a sharp point at the bottom. You use it to check for soil compaction, to see how deep the moisture goes, to feel for plowpan. It's a way of reading the story of the soil without digging a hole. I walked back out to the circle the horses had defined for me. I started on the outside of the perimeter, about 10 feet away from my nearest stake. I set the point of the probe on the ground, gripped the handle, and pushed. It slid into the black earth with a satisfying, smooth resistance. This was good soil, deep and rich. I pushed it all the way down to the handle. 36 inches of clean, unobstructed topsoil. I pulled it out, wiped the dirt from the shaft, and moved 5 feet closer to the circle. I did it again. Same result. The ground was consistent. Then, I stepped just inside the circle of stakes. I found the approximate center, the place where the horses seemed most reluctant to go. I set the point of the probe down. I took a breath. I pushed. For the first 12 inches, it felt the same. Good, rich soil giving way under the pressure. Then, at about 14 inches, the resistance changed. It became gritty, sandy. I knew what that was. It was fill. Soil that had been moved, not laid down by millennia of prairie grass. I kept pushing. 18 inches. 20. 24. And then, at 26 inches, the probe stopped. It didn't just slow down. It stopped dead. The handle vibrated in my hands with a solid, definitive thud. It was the feeling of steel hitting stone. I leaned on it, putting my full weight onto the handle. Nothing. Not an inch of give. It was like pushing against the foundation of the earth. My heart was hammering. This wasn't a fieldstone. A fieldstone, even a big one, will shift a little when you put 200 pounds of pressure on it with a steel point. This was flat, solid, immovable. I pulled the probe out and moved it 2 feet to the right, still inside the circle. I pushed again. The same thing happened. Smooth soil, then gritty fill, and then, at 26 inches, a hard stop. Clunk. I spent the next hour working a grid inside that 20-foot circle. I must have probed the ground 50 times. And every single time, I hit the same solid, unyielding surface at almost the exact same depth. It was a lid.
A capítulo.
Something flat and wide and man-made, buried just over 2 feet beneath the grass. I was standing on top of a roof. I finally pulled the probe out for the last time and stood there, breathing heavily, the handle of the tool cool in my sweaty palms. The horses were watching me from a safe distance, their big, dark eyes curious. They had known. All this time they had known. The subtle vibration, the different sound the ground made under their massive weight, the slight hollowness that no human could ever detect. They had felt it all. They hadn't just been avoiding a spot. They had been respecting a structure. I walked back to the house, my mind racing. I went straight to the kitchen table and took out the notebook again, opening it to the hand-drawn map. Cistern. It was no longer a question. Check spring line, that was the next step. Never dug, my grandfather had left the last part to me. That evening, I finally told Martha. I laid the notebook on the table and showed her the map, the note. I told her about the horses, how they wouldn't walk on the spot. I told her about the soil probe, about the solid thing buried 26 inches down. She listened, her eyes on the page, then on my face. She traced the drawing of the pasture with her finger. She didn't say I was crazy. She didn't say I was wasting my time. She just looked at me for a long moment. So, she said, her voice calm and practical as always, when are you going to start digging? The next morning, I was out before 5. I didn't take the tractor. I didn't take the post-hole digger. I took a spade and a shovel. This was something that needed to be done by hand. I wanted to feel the ground give way. I wanted to uncover the secret, not just excavate it. I started at the center of the circle, right where my probe had hit the most solid point. The sod was thick, the roots of the prairie grasses woven into a dense mat. I cut a neat square about 3 feet by 3 feet and peeled it back like a carpet, making sure to keep it intact so I could lay it back down later. Beneath it was the black gold, the deep, loamy topsoil that had made this land valuable for generations. It was cool and damp and smelled of life. The digging was easy at first. The shovel slid into the earth with a clean, slicing sound. 12 inches down, just as the probe had predicted, the soil changed. It became looser, mixed with sand and small pieces of gravel. It was unmistakably fill. Someone had dug a hole here a long time ago and then had filled it back in. I slowed down, my senses on high alert. I was digging into the past now. At about 2 feet, the shovel struck something with a dull scrape. Not the sharp clank of steel on rock, but a softer sound. I got down on my knees and cleared the dirt away with my hands. My fingers brushed against something cool and flat. Wood. It was a plank about an inch thick and maybe 8 inches wide. It was old, dark with moisture, but it was still solid. It was oak. I kept digging carefully now, following the line of the plank. I uncovered another one next to it, and another. It was a layer of heavy oak boards, laid side by side. A protective covering. Beneath them I knew would be the stone. I found a gap between 2 of the planks and worked the tip of the shovel in, using it as a lever. With a groan of old, wet wood, the first plank lifted. I pulled it out of the hole, and there it was, a single, massive, flat piece of limestone. It was gray and smooth, clearly worked by hand. It wasn't a random boulder. It was a capstone. The edges were cut square. It was fitted perfectly against the stones next to it, the seams so tight you couldn't fit a knife blade between them. I had found the roof. I just sat back on my heels, looking at that single exposed piece of stone. The sun was clearing the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. The horses had come closer, forming a silent audience. It was real. Everything the horses had felt, everything my grandfather had suspected, it was all real. And it was right here under my feet. I knew I couldn't move this alone. I needed help, and I needed someone who knew what they were looking at. There was only one person to call. His name was Amos Miller. He was in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, and he'd spent 50 years of his life as a well driller in our county. He was retired now, but his mind was as sharp as the drill bits he used to command. If there was water to be found under the ground, Amos knew how to find it. He'd learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from his. They didn't use geological surveys or satellite imagery. They used what they called water witching, a forked willow branch and a lifetime of paying attention to the way the land folded and the types of trees that grew in certain places. Most modern farmers dismissed it as folk magic, but I'd seen Amos find water on properties the geologists had declared dry as a bone. He answered the phone on the second ring, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I told him who I was and what I'd found. I didn't embellish. I just told him the facts. The horses, the notebook, the solid thing 26 inches down, the capstone. He was silent for a long time. I thought maybe the line had gone dead. Then he said, "I'll be there in an hour." He arrived not in a shiny new pickup, but in a 20-year-old Chevy C10. The paint faded to a dull blue. He was a small, wiry man with hands that looked like they were carved from old leather. He didn't say a word when he got out of the truck. He just gave me a short nod and walked with me out to the field. He walked around the circle of stakes I'd put up, his eyes on the ground. He watched the horses who were watching him. He seemed to be taking in the whole scene at once. The lay of the land, the behavior of the animals, the quality of the light. He finally came to the hole I had dug and knelt beside it. His movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the exposed limestone for a long time. He reached out a gnarled finger and traced the seam between the stones. He picked up a handful of the sandy-filled dirt and let it run through his fingers, smelling it, feeling its texture. I just stood there, waiting. I knew better than to rush him. Amos worked at his own pace, a pace that was synchronized with the deep, slow rhythms of the earth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at me. His eyes were a pale, clear blue. "Your grandfather was a smart man," he said. It was the highest compliment he could give. "And so are your horses." He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. "This here," he said, gesturing to the hole, "is old, very old. Older than your grandfather, I'd wager. This is the kind of work they did before power tools, before concrete. This is fitted stone, built to last forever." He walked to the edge of the circle and pointed to a gentle rise in the land a few hundred yards to the north. "That's your spring line," he said with absolute certainty. "The water table is high up there. It runs underground, following a seam of gravel, right to this spot. Whoever built this knew that. They found the vein and they tapped it." I asked him what he thought it was. "It's a cistern, all right," he said. But not the kind you're thinking of, not for collecting rainwater off a roof. This is a reservoir. A holding tank built right into the earth. Substantial, that was the word he used. Substantial. It was a plain word, an understated word, but coming from Amos Miller it was like a thunderclap. It meant this was not some small, forgotten relic. It was a serious piece of engineering. He went back to his truck and came back with a long steel bar and a heavy sledgehammer. "Let's see what's inside," he said. It took us the better part of 2 hours to get the first capstone loose. It was heavy, at least 400 pounds, and fitted so perfectly that we had to chip away at the edges just to get a purchase for the bar. But finally, with a great groan, it shifted. We levered it up and slid it to the side, revealing a square, dark opening. A wave of cool, clean air washed over us. It smelled of damp stone, of earth, and of pure, cold water. There was no foulness to it, no smell of stagnation. It was the smell of life. We peered into the darkness. We couldn't see the bottom. I went and got a powerful flashlight from the barn and a weighted string. I aimed the beam into the hole. The walls were made of the same hand-cut limestone, fitted together without a speck of mortar. They went straight down, perfectly plumb. And at the bottom, shimmering in the beam of the flashlight, was water. It was crystal clear. I lowered the weighted string into the hole until it touched the bottom. Then I pulled it up, measuring hand over hand. The stone walls went down 12 feet from the capstone. I lowered it again until the weight touched the surface of the water. The water was 8 feet deep. A 20-foot diameter circle, 12 feet deep, holding 8 feet of water. My mind, accustomed to calculating fertilizer rates and bushels per acre, started doing the math. It was thousands and thousands of gallons. A fortune in water, sitting silently beneath my most useless field. Amos was quiet again, just looking down into the darkness. "They covered it proper," he said, almost to himself. "They laid those oak planks on top of the stone, and then they put the fill dirt on, and then they laid the sod back over the top. They built it so you would never even know it was here unless you knew exactly where to look." He looked at me. "Or unless you had something heavy enough and smart enough to feel it from the surface." He nodded toward the horses, who were still standing nearby, their silent vigil unbroken. They had been the key. They were the ones who had held the secret all along. The machine would have scraped the rocks off the top and never known a thing. The skid steer, with its speed and its power, would have driven right over the top of the greatest treasure on my farm and would have been completely blind to it. Took patience. It took trust in an older, slower kind of wisdom. My grandfather's note hadn't been a map to a cistern. It had been a reminder to pay attention to the horses. We spent the rest of the day uncovering the rest of the cistern. With Amos's knowledge of leverage and my brute strength, we managed to slide back 4 of the central capstones, creating an opening about 6 feet square. The sheer scale of the thing was breathtaking. It was like a hidden cathedral under the field. A silent, water-filled chamber built with astonishing skill and patience. The craftsmanship was something you just don't see anymore. Every stone was perfectly squared, perfectly fitted. There were no gaps, no crumbling mortar. It was a sealed vessel, protected from surface contamination, fed by a deep, clean spring. The next day, I bought a small, gas-powered pump and 100 feet of hose. I dropped the intake into the cistern and fired up the engine. A moment later, a thick, steady stream of clear, cold water began gushing out onto the pasture. It was almost shocking to see it, to see this hidden resource brought out into the sunlight. I let the pump run for 3 hours straight. The stream never faltered, never slowed. I checked the water level in the cistern, and it had barely dropped an inch. The spring that fed it was strong and steady. It was refilling as fast as I could pump it out. This changed everything. It wasn't just about water for the livestock. This much water meant I could irrigate. I could put the back 40 into high-value crops, vegetables, maybe even an orchard. In a dry year, when everyone else was watching their corn burn up in the fields, I would have a guaranteed supply of water. This cistern wasn't just a feature of the farm. It was its future. It was a buffer against drought, a source of new income, a legacy. The $42,000 for the skid steer suddenly seemed like a pittance compared to the value of what was under my feet. The skid steer was a depreciating asset. This was a permanent resource, something that would serve this farm for another 100 years, just as it had likely served someone 100 years before me. A few days later, Dave drove by again. This time he stopped his truck, got out, and walked over to the fence. He didn't say anything for a minute, just looked at the massive stone-lined hole in the middle of the field, the pump sitting beside it, the dark, wet patch on the grass where the water had been flowing. The horses were grazing peacefully nearby. "Heard you found water," he said finally. His voice was flat, without any of the joking tone from before. "I did," I said. He shook his head slowly, his eyes on the perfectly fitted stones. "My God," he said, his voice quiet. "I've driven past this field my whole life. My dad farmed right up to this fence line. We always called it the rock patch." He looked at the horses, then back at me. "You might not be as wrong as I thought," he said. It was the closest Dave would ever come to a full apology, and it was more than enough. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that there are other ways of knowing things, other forms of value that don't show up on a balance sheet or a spec sheet for a new piece of machinery. He got back in his truck and drove away without another word. The quiet concession was the only vindication I needed. That evening, I sat on the edge of the cistern, my feet dangling over the dark, cool water. The 25 Belgians were spread out across the pasture, their big shapes dark against the fading light of the sunset. They had done their job. They had shown me the way. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about his quiet patience, his deep understanding of this place. He hadn't just left me a farm. He'd left me a set of instructions, a way of seeing. The notebook wasn't the treasure. The cistern wasn't even the treasure. The treasure was the knowledge that if you listen, really listen, the land will tell you its secrets. The animals will tell you. The old voices will tell you. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them. The modern world is loud. It's full of certainty, of data, of fast, expensive answers. But sometimes the best answers are quiet and slow. Sometimes the most valuable things are the things that have been overlooked, forgotten, buried under a thin layer of sod. My grandfather had a saying for it. "You can't farm what you've already spent." I used to think he was just talking about money, about not going into debt for fancy equipment. But sitting there, I realized he meant something more. You can't farm what you've spent in attention, in patience, in reverence. If you're moving too fast, looking for the easy answer, you spend all your capacity to see what's really there. The horses had cost me money, yes, but they had bought me time. They had forced me to slow down, to walk the ground at their pace, to see the world through their eyes. And in doing so, they had revealed a value that had been there all along, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. The ground remembers. That was the lesson. It remembers where the water is, it remembers where the foundations are, it remembers the hands that shaped it long ago. And the horses, they remember too. Their instincts are a form of memory, a library of knowledge passed down through generations, stretching back to a time before fences and plows, before men were even here. And if you're willing to trust them, they'll share that memory with you. If you've got your own piece of ground, your own back 40 with a stubborn problem that everyone has a fast, modern answer for, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Maybe there's an old notebook in your attic, or a quiet wisdom in the animals you care for. Subscribe if this meant something to you, because sometimes the best way forward is to take a step back, to listen to the old voices, and to trust the ground beneath your feet.